many fans, Final Fantasy is known for globe-spanning adventures, unique game design, and memorable music. It's largely an imaginative and innovative series, adored for its personality, warmth, engrossing strategy, and understated depth. Yet, the series is mostly associated with the 1990s. With Final Fantasy XV, Square Enix hopes to redefine and modernize the brand without trampling on or altogether abandoning its legacy.
What is this? We just were sent on a magical journey and we're pushing a car?
15 seeks to combine the freedom and scope of MMOs and open-world sandbox games with the immersion and narrative gravitas of offline RPGs. What this approach achieves is as surprising as what it leaves out. Though in some respects it embodies many of the problems with today's AAA strata, and though its many moving parts often conflict where they should cohere, broadly speaking, 15 builds on its pedigree as it innovates the genre of action RPG open-world game design. 15 is a modular assemblage of disparate ideas and design decisions, a bricolage lacking in a unifying focus. The core mechanics and verve are there, just as broad aspects of the story and world show a ton of promise, but the classic Final Fantasy formula simply cannot fit into a modular, decentralized framework. Many, if not most, of 15's issues arise from this contradiction of aims. Today's game consumer puts unreasonable demands on AAA developers, through no fault of our own. In the era of big data, we have a glut of entertainment options. Content within digital space is quite literally limitless. From Netflix to MMOs to Spotify, today's consumer can engage with media as much as they want without ever exhausting the supply. Yet as much as this climate caters to consumer demand, it has also changed the act of media consumption itself. We are less patient, less open-minded, and less flexible as consumers than ever before, largely due to the idea that we're entitled to feel like the master of our own reality, that media ought cater to our preferences or else. According to Aaron Fisher's Media and New Capitalism in the Digital Age, the internet came about under the hope that it would provide, quote, individual empowerment, authenticity, and creativity towards mitigating alienation, end quote. If true, it's no wonder that as people in Western-style societies lose opportunities and hope for a better tomorrow, they seem to feel more and more entitled to a digital life as uncompromisingly servile as society expects them to be. Shit doesn't so much run downhill as it does in a circle. So the media creators of today face an ever-growing horde of expectant consumers who often react to perceived slights with explosions of infantile rage. The internet is a kind of virtual prosthetic, a digital stand-in for a world largely deprived of life or fulfillment offline.
Oh my God! Oh my God, nobody look! Nobody look! Nobody look!
Hence, like Dennis Hopper in Blue Velvet, we compensate for our lack by acting out in extreme and occasionally absurd bombastic displays.
Oh, look at those. Oh, what are these? Don't say please, fuckhead!
It's due to this social climate that AAA developers and other large-scale content creators frantically attempt to meet our every demand, even though different people demand different things. Generally, though, we all sort of demand amazing graphics and as many hours of potential gameplay as possible from a $60 experience. To meet these demands, costs for AAA development have skyrocketed. This cost creates a feedback loop in how it exacerbates the necessity for devs to please as many consumers as possible to recoup the cost. Is it any wonder then that AAA games over the last decade or so have become more and more bloated, generic, unartistic, and repetitive? Artistic risks alienate or even offend potential buyers, while many consumers simply want a shinier, prettier version of what they've already experienced.
You can't put this in your mouth and chew it? No.
So repulsed by most foods, she survives almost entirely on French fries.
People are no longer willing, broadly speaking of course, to meet creators halfway or keep an open mind. Money's just too tight and there are too many safe alternatives for many of us to bother. All of this helps explain why the opening screen of Final Fantasy XV reads, "A Final Fantasy for fans and first-timers." This game desperately craves the near-universal acclaim that the series enjoyed in the 1990s, while it also recognizes just how fully both games and society have changed. Yet 15 doesn't seem created with an understanding of how and why the 90s and today, as eras in gaming, are incommensurable. Roughly, it's a distinction between vertebrates and invertebrates, between centralized and modular game design. In Final Fantasy VII, for example, we have a paradigmatic case of centralized game design. On the surface, it has much in common with 15. 7 was exorbitantly expensive, it was innovative, and according to its director and co-writer Yoshinori Kitase, the team, quote, looked at trends in the foreign-made PC games of the time to design its technical aspects. But FF7 is centralized around a single goal: telling a story. Even the combat serves this purpose insofar as it introduces dramatic tension over whether the party survives and boosts the sense of triumph you feel knowing at the end that Cloud's victories were as much yours as his. FF7 is paced well. It knows not to rush or skip important details. Sephiroth is introduced gradually, just like the wider world outside Midgar. Story elements and aspects of the world building are given space to breathe. The narrative and characters are expansive, but not to the point of becoming convoluted or confusing. FF7 is dialogue heavy, which inadvertently brings focus and clarity from beat to beat in the story progression. You're often fighting as much to see what happens next as you are to level up. This structure is consistent, coordinated, and cohesive. Even as the world map opens up, allowing for much more player freedom, FF7's focus is unfaltering. It's precisely this focus that gives such iconic sequences like Aerith's death or the flashback scene their power and precision. Yet FF7 was made when games still aspired to be like movies. Square tried a similar model with 13 over a decade later, with severely less impressive results. Because by the late 2000s, companies like BioWare and Bethesda had proven that narrative-heavy sandbox or pseudo-sandbox games could be much more immersive and interactive than FF7's model of centralized, somewhat passive storytelling. The standardizing of voice acting also introduced new localization challenges that didn't really exist in FF7's era. By FF13, a lot more could be lost in translation. Many in the West criticized 13 for being what they deemed one long cutscene-laden hallway. Few of its critics felt like hearing out its story or trying to like characters other than Lightning. The combat system, too, took time to learn. In short, nothing about 13 was immediate or interactive or interesting enough for it to achieve a broad, favorable consensus in the West. It seemed dull, slow, and frustrating alongside Mass Effect, Elder Scrolls 4, or Fallout 3. Clearly, Square Enix needed to westernize its flagship JRPG if it wanted to seriously compete in Western markets. The question then became, how do they get players to care about a story or its characters through gameplay? How can Square create a game as moving and as memorable as FF7 with GTA's level of open-world sandbox design and a game as addictive and massive as a mini MMO? FF15 is the result of this striving towards a perfect modern AAA action RPG. In it, you play as Prince Noctis as he and his 3 amigos go on an epic journey to save their homeland. To start with, the combat system in 15 is extremely addictive and fun, even if the mid-battle camera needs work. Personally, I think 15 has a better combat system with much more nuance and strategic depth than any action RPG that I've ever played. Spending AP points to gain abilities is straightforward, if not derivative of Skyrim, and like any RPG worth its name, 15 rewards multiple playthroughs and varying up your weapons, strategies, and spells. Even more impressively, FF15 does what most action RPGs consistently fail to do. It stays challenging and engaging, provided you're willing to go a little out of your way to seek out the tougher bosses and baddies out there. In every Fallout since it jumped to 3D, by level 20 or so you can basically kill anybody or thing you want with one hand tied behind your back. And unlike Bethesda's or BioWare's action RPGs, 15 finds ways to present challenges outside simply dramatically increasing the enemy's health bar. Each weapon in 15 comes with a totally unique feel and strategy. The in-fight animations are spectacularly epic without feeling too fake or showboaty. Combat in 15 may work as magnificently as it does because it's one of the few mechanics in the game that feels focused or imposes specific limits on your freedom, since you can only control Noctis outside triggering special attacks, using items, and performing the always awesome Link Strikes. The same restraint and focus is brought to bear on your party members as well. Again, to excellent effect. All 4 leads in 15 feel like fully formed personalities. They really do act like a group of best friends, even as they argue or disagree or give each other crap. These 4 comprise 15's heart and soul. Their journey together stays compelling to the very end, an end that I admit moved me to tears. I overall enjoyed 15 largely on the basis of how well it nailed these 2 central elements, its combat and its camaraderie. If only everything else wasn't so disjointed and hazy. The open world, it's admittedly very fun and immersive to just drive around in, let alone discover quests, but the modularity of open world design works against story momentum, in this case as well as a general principle. And considering how little of the main story there is to speak of, this problem is only intensified in FF15. Centralized storytelling in games deals in terms of cause and effect. Modular storytelling, like you'll find in many sandbox games on the other hand, is more about standalone, self-contained chunks of often unrelated events. The former is like a single slow-building parabola from inciting incident to climax to conclusion. The latter is a series of small peaks and valleys like a EKG machine. You violate tone and pacing if you're thrown back into the cheerful open world in between a dramatic crisis, yet you violate the basic framework of open world game design if you lock players out of that open world for story reasons. This is the conflict keeping 15 from feeling as cohesive as it maybe could, because it shifts from one to the other, only bringing things together near the very end. Confusingly, you can opt to travel back in time to break up the latter half's shift towards closed world story and dungeons, which just throws the game's stability even further out of whack. This problem is shared by Bethesda's games. It's hard to feel immersed or impacted by a story that starts and stops on a dime, often with little consequence. Yet, as I outlined in the opening, I don't blame Square Enix for feeling the pressure to perform the unperformable. Besides, even if the story has huge chunks missing, a just okay villain, and too many key events that occur off-screen, the gameplay stays engaging and the core dynamic among friends is genuinely moving. Yet the main story suffers thanks to the game's modular and elliptical design because of how much more time you spend free-roaming, monster hunting, and side-questing than you are engaged or even privy to the central narrative. Even if most of the story beats work well, the game takes a serious abrupt shift once the drama amps up. What's there hardly feels befitting such a huge game, both in terms of scope and stakes. If you're willing to comb the game for story tidbits, buy the guide, and read forums and the fan wiki, you'll find a decent story splintered and scattered across the 4 winds here. I think the developers may have wanted heavier lore material to rest on the margins as Easter eggs for the die-hard fans, while keeping the mandatory scenes and events focused on the emotions and relationship between the 4 leads. Maybe Square caught wind that many players in the West were bored by 13's exposition-heavy, jargon-heavy cutscenes? It's also possible this elliptical style is their attempt to keep 15 grounded on relatable emotions and struggles rather than a lot of high fantasy stuff. The later bits may feel underwhelming simply because I'm stuck comparing 15 to older Final Fantasies. It would be inaccurate and unfair to forget how much content in 15 exists outside the main quest. Perhaps if the centerpiece story had been as involved and operatic as the old games, few players would have bothered to check out the rest. It seems much more fair to compare 15 not with other Final Fantasies, but to games like Skyrim or Mafia 3. Within this context, the central questline is just one of countless possible adventures to get lost in. And unlike Skyrim, the protagonist and his companions in 15 don't feel like robots or non-entities. Even if there's no denying that Skyrimification meant compromising on tradition, I have to say I like and respect 15's reconfiguring itself around gameplay first and foremost. Because the upside to 15's extreme emphasis on gameplay is twofold. One, it makes it easier and more enjoyable to play and explore everything it has to offer, and two, it gives the entire experience a sense of really belonging to you and only you. Yet again, 15 seems to strongly emphasize the experience and feels of playing it instead of hoping a huge number of players will connect with cutscenes and expository dialogue. Even though 15 doesn't necessarily compare well to the story or centralized design of classic Final Fantasy, that's okay because I'm not sure it wants to. In fact, 15 seems quite deliberately to depart from tradition and reinvent the brand for today's market. It has much more heart and drama than Skyrim, Fallout, or say Mafia 3, while I enjoyed its combat and exploration as much or more than any of those. 15 may make for a disjointed, low stakes, and overextended retro Final Fantasy, but as a game of this decade, it's probably the best open world action RPG since The Witcher 3. Even The Witcher 3, for all its incredible features, isn't as innovative as 15 for my money, because while The Witcher 3 is, at the end of the day, a perfected and polished version of what we got with Witcher 1 and 2, 15 tries many things that I'm not sure have ever been tried before. I'd say it's charming and lifelike 4 leads, its visceral yet tactical combat, and its staggering amount of hidden or hard-to-catch content more than make up for what would have otherwise been a confused and underwhelming mess lacking in narrative complexity or depth. So here's to Final Fantasy XV, a perhaps overly ambitious and flawed game that's trying something new and having a hell of a lot of fun doing it.